Hello, everybody. My name is Althea. I'm an organizer with the United Food and Commercial Workers Local 5. That is the grocery store union. So if you've been to a Safeway, thank you, union worker. I work all throughout sort of the Bay Area down to Santa Cruz, and originally got started down here when the REI in Santa Cruz unionized. And that union effort is really, give it up for the REI that unionized. This is the 10th REI across the country to unionize. We've been in a fight with them now for about a year and a half, almost 2 years, at the bargaining table fighting against Morgan Lewis. If anyone knows anything about the state of labor, we know that Morgan Lewis is horrible. This is a company that is working with Elon Musk to get rid of the NLRB. Also trying to bust the union at Trader Joe's. So these are all shared struggles, and I think a lot of this organizing that we're seeing pop up now, we got a lot in common in both in our struggles and our fights, but also in what our solutions will be. So I'm really excited to have this beautiful panel here today of worker organizers and activists of all sorts. And I want to thank Josh for opening this space to us. Barrios Unidos has played such an important role in Santa Cruz. It's really lovely to, just have material solidarity for each other, right? Because sometimes we bargained at 521 just this past week, so it definitely takes a family. And none of this could have been possible without our lovely interns from the Labor Center at UC Santa Cruz. I'm going to pass it off to Mia, who's going to be our MC, but it's really exciting to just see so many different folks from all different organizations and stuff all in this room to talk about what organizing is like and how we can stay in the fight and win contracts and build the labor movement. So I'm going to pass it off to Mia. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mia. I was one of the interns at UFCW Local 5 this summer through the Labor Summer Program at the Labor Center at UC Santa Cruz. So also really quickly shout out to my co-intern Leslie, who couldn't be here today, but also played such a huge role in making today happen. And along with 7 other interns, we learned a lot about organizing, about unionizing. It was a really productive summer, and also super thankful for people already involved who made it such a welcoming space for new interested people, young people joining the labor movement. So in the spirit of getting people involved, thank you all for coming as we, make an effort to center conversations of labor and organizing in the area. So Josh, do you want to really quickly just talk about the space, and then we'll have Steve McKay, we'll talk about just the context of organizing in the area.
Hello everybody, welcome to Barrios Unidos. Really excited to have this event. Barrios was started in 1977 by our current executive director, Nani Alejandrez. And the goal was, at the time, was to end gang violence, to counter violence and group violence. But over the years, it's evolved. We've evolved to work in the prisons. We've evolved to work with the community, doing mutual aid projects, leadership development. And it was really, Nani was really inspired by Cesar Chavez and Filipino farm workers that were organizing at that time. We knew that people have the ability to get together and make change in their community. So now, we take an intersectional approach. We know that violence manifests itself in many different forms, and especially in economic exploitation. And we realize that real power as people come from our labor and what we produce in society. So this is labor has been a part of Barrios, and I want to make sure that it's increasingly a part of our programming, so that we're making real systemic change. Little housekeeping: there's 2 bathrooms right here, and after, if people want to walk around and tour, I can give like a brief guided tour on what we have. We have a food pantry, we have different programs, and the space is really open for everybody to come, gather, bring brainstorm, create projects. So I'm really happy to have everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Thanks, Barrios, UNIDOS. And again, so my name is Steve McKay, and I teach up at UC Santa Cruz, and I'm the faculty director of the Center for Labor and Community. And we're kind of an expanded new center, in large part because unions around the state basically help fight to increase funding for the research needed around labor. And so we exist to do research to support working people and to support the union movement. And we're a public university, so the idea is you should be serving the public good. And this, of course, and unions in particular, are about sort of providing better conditions, right, and more power for workers. And so we help sponsor the Labor Summer. So we have been helping build what you might call the student to movement pipeline through unions and getting a. And we're talking and working a lot with other unions, and Francisco and the Monterey Bay Labor Council and Hector and others to find out different ways that students and young people could become part of the movement. Because one of the things we know is young people are the movement right now. And one of the things they asked is just to provide a little bit of context about what the labor movement and what's been changing and what's not been changing. So I just want to speak really briefly about that, thinking about California. So first, California has one of the highest union densities in the country. There's 2.8 million California workers that work under a union contract. Now that's much higher and it's been pretty stable, but it's still not that many if you think about how big California is. About 58% of workers, of those union members, are in public sector unions, and only about 10% of people in private sector businesses are unionized. So we have this huge discrepancy. But we've seen California, the union movement's been changing and it's been growing recently, right? So now, as it's getting bigger, at least half of California's members now are women, and the majority of California union members are workers of color. And we've seen in this area and across California huge pushes. So we saw, just last summer, the Red Hot Labor Summer with the Hollywood, the writers, and the actors. We saw it here, very close, across UCs, the graduate students, one of the largest groups under UAW, win an enormous contract. And then, of course, here at Starbucks, we've had the first Starbucks in California, Unionize. We're here in Santa Cruz. And then we've had other areas like REI, movements at Trader Joe's, Bookshop Santa Cruz. So we've seen this push in this area. So it's interesting to see that there has been these pushes even in in both the private sector. But why such a huge discrepancy between the amount of people in public sector unions? So over half the public sector workers are unionized and only 10% of private sector. Well, in large part it's because that in the public sector, they're less likely to oppose unionization. Not that they're against it, but they're less likely to mount big campaigns against it. Where in the private sector, that is the name of the game and has been since the 1970s. And so I want to say a little bit about the anti-union movement, the union busting industry. And it is $1 billion industry, right? And it started in the 70s and 80s when unions were becoming powerful, that management decided that we needed to hire people to help bust unions and come up with strategies. So they started hiring management consultants, and they put together in the 70s, 80s, stuff we see today, and we'll hear it. So that kind of toolkit of the union busting includes threats, interrogation, promises, intimidation, coercion, retaliation, all kinds of communications, and now we see especially delay, like foot dragging. So employers now spend $400 million a year on anti-union and union busting consultants. So Morgan Lewis, who REI hired, is one of the largest law firms in the country, right? They have 2,200 lawyers, right? And one of their biggest clients, besides Trump and Elon Musk, have been large companies like Microsoft, Google, General Electric, DaVita, but also REI and others, right, that have been hired to thwart organizing. And they've really come up with the key tactics, and we're going to learn more about this. But one of the things they found is that they do a lot that's illegal, but there's very few penalties for breaking the law. In fact, in union elections, more than 40% of employers break the law during union elections and union drives. So what do they do? Well, one, we'll hear about more of these, but surveillance and intimidation. We've seen a growing use of electronic surveillance, including GPS tagging, including cameras, and surveilling social media to surveil workers. Retaliation has been one of the biggest ones. We see that clearly in the Starbucks campaign. Layoffs, discharges, harassment, cutting of hours, changing working conditions. They found at least 40% of campaigns that we see this kind of employer retaliation. But the big problem is that the penalties are very weak and generally unenforced. So basically, they can get away with it. Contract obstructions. Again, you'll hear more about this, but delaying for months or even years once they've had it. So we'll hear about this. But in one study, while 70% of union campaigns that were brought to the National Labor Relations Board were successful, after a year, only 36% of those campaigns had a first contract. And even 3 years out, only 70% of them did, right? So you imagine, 3 years they're waiting to get a contract. Forced indoctrination. So we know many have been subject to this captive audience meetings where workers are required to attend meetings. In a typical campaign, employers will require 16 of these captive audience campaigns. Also one-on-one meetings. The other is to fire striking workers. Again, illegal, but totally typical. And misclassification. So purposely classifying employees as independent contractors in different ways. So we see this all over, just at Starbucks. And again, this is what the NLRB found, not even just what the unions accuse them of. But the NLRB issued complaints against Starbucks for 29 unfair labor practice violations and violations of over 200 labor laws just in their campaigns across the country. So we see this all over. Now, what's been interesting is that there's been a push toward going toward unionization in different industries than typically found. And in large parts, there have been pushes toward those areas where they're less likely to fight the union. So, and where those are often in retail and in media and other front-facing businesses where customers and community can exert more leverage if they use anti-union campaign. So thinking about this in REI, they're less willing to use captive audience because they're afraid their customers will get pissed off. So you got to remember, as the landscape changes, so does our tactics, right? And that's why the research is actually really interesting. One thing encouraging is that neutrality agreements have gotten more common. So they've gone from 3% of campaigns to about 9% of campaigns where they get neutrality agreements. In terms of employers not engaging in opposition, it went from 3% to 13%. So, and that's really important because often that's a broader-based campaign, a community-based campaign to get employers to sign neutrality agreements and not to oppose unionization. So if we think about like how could unions help each other, how could the community help different things, it's in these kind of front-facing areas where the community can put pressure on employers for neutrality agreements or for non-opposition. So win rates when they have it are as high as 93% when there are neutrality agreements, and 86% win rates when they don't have a campaign. But the win rates drop to 65% if employers use these campaigns. So that's the thing is, why do they use anti-union strategies? It's because given the current labor laws, they work. And so we have to be cognizant of that and then think about, well, what do you do? And that leads me to the last bit is about the PRO Act, which is the Protecting the Right to Organize Act. And this is national legislation that they've been trying to get passed for a long time, and it's still being held up by the Senate. It was first introduced in 2019, but it's basically to reform the National Labor Relations Act to make it more fair, as what it was intended in 1935 when it was passed, right? And that's to make the field more fair for workers and to not allow employers so much power. So it'll give workers more control over when they have the time of elections, It would outlaw intimidation and things like captive audience meetings. It would require the NLRB to go to court and get injunction to if they retaliate and fire workers. And one of the big things, it would impose penalties for employers that break the law. So right now, there's basically no penalties. So it would very much increase the penalties and make them civilly liable if they break election laws, or different laws. It's very important that it creates a roadmap to a first contract. So if they're dragging their feet, employers would have to go to mandatory arbitration to get a contract in the first year. It cracks down on worker misclassification, and it strengthens strikes. It will no longer disallow secondary boycotts, so that'll be something, and it will not allow anymore the permanent replacing of workers when they strike. So the PRO Act, and we have some of these elements in California, and we have some elements in agriculture. So the recently law passed where the UFCW has been doing more organizing because they're allowing card check in the fields now. We see that when there's changes at the policy level, workers and communities and unions are ready, right? What's been stopping the movement to raise those densities has been employers and the law firms that they hire to stop organizing. So that's just some of the context, and it means that we'll hear from the panel all about these elements going on, both the anti-union stuff, and then, I think we want to open it up to think about, well, what could we do collectively, right, now, and then as we go farther, to think about what are our strategies, and what we hope is that the university and the Center for Labor Study could be part of that conversation. And where there's research that might be important, we have students who are interested, who know how to do research. That's what we're training to do. But they don't always do it in the, for particular things. But I think we have a lot of students who are interested. So we're really eager to work with you, hear how you're dealing with both dealing with employers, but thinking about strategy. What would be helpful in your campaigns to do? So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. It is always helpful to have the educational background. But I'm super excited to introduce our panel. As an organizer, always want to pass the mic to the workers. They are the ones that understand what's going on. And glad that we have the Labor Council and the university here to listen. So I'll pass off the mic, but I'm just going to do a quick overview. Jazz is a wonderful, wonderful organizer who's now at the UC Berkeley Labor Center doing a Inside Organizer School, which is to teach people how to salt. I think talking about salting will be a huge thing we're going to want to do today. Lynn is a worker at CVS, and she and I actually have been working together about issues that she faces in her store. Also just an incredible community activist here in Santa Cruz and in the South Bay. Veronica is a grad student worker and a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz studying labor-related things, and will have a lot of interesting insight to provide us. Megan, star of the show, was one of the lead people of the organizing committee at REI Santa Cruz, the reason we're all here today, and is now a member of the bargaining committee. We had bargaining with Morgan Lewis just last week. And then Chris was also a SALT at an Amazon plant in Bessemer, Alabama. So we've got a whole range of folks with all different experiences that really are, the cutting edge of how we're going to fight the class war. So I'm going to hand the mic off, and I'll ask some questions later, but just want folks to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their organizing that they've done, and different roadblocks they've faced, and how you've combat them with your coworkers and with community. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Althea. So my name is Jazz Brisek. I use they, them pronouns. And like Althea said, I'm now at the UC Berkeley Labor Center working on the Inside Organizer School. We're having one November 8th to 10th. And so there's flyers. If you're interested in attending, talk to me after the fact. The origins of the school go back a long way. I first got involved with union organizing as a student at the University of Mississippi, volunteering with the UAW's campaign to organize the Nissan plant in Canton outside of Jackson, Mississippi. That was a beautiful campaign with all kinds of community support, Nissan's attempts to co-opt the community and start suddenly sponsoring all of these civil rights anniversaries that were happening when they'd never showed any interest in civil rights anniversaries up until the union campaign, didn't work because people wanted to have accountability and wanted to support the union. But at that point, the UAW was not interested in holding Nissan accountable for their union busting. And so the Inside Organizer School arose out of a desire to give workers more ability to form organizing committees, start organizing, and form organizations that would hold companies accountable for union busting if the union, like the UAW at that time, when the president was going to jail for corruption, were not going to do that. So after my time in Mississippi, I ended up moving to upstate New York to work on the barista organizing projects that were happening there. In 2017, workers at Gimme Coffee in Ithaca had organized the first ever barista union in the country. And they faced and still face a lot of union busting there, but they showed that it could be done. And people at other coffee shops, first regionally, started thinking, wait, if they can do it, we can do it. So workers at Spot Coffee in Rochester and then in Buffalo reached out about organizing. And the company there responded first terribly by firing 3 workers for trying to unionize out of the 6 people who'd come to the first meeting. But the community in Buffalo did respond by calling a boycott of Spot Coffee and cutting the company's business by at least 40% based on what workers were telling us their sales had dropped to. And within a month or so, they had signed the Fair Election Principles, which were a set of voluntary guidelines for corporate conduct during union elections, where they wouldn't threaten workers, they wouldn't fire workers. If they had an anti-union captive audience meeting, then the union would get equal time. And they signed a contract where workers got an average increase of $4 an hour. So that showed what boycotting could do. I ended up, after that, after Starbucks workers had reached out and one person had been fired for trying to unionize, becoming assault at the store in Buffalo that became the first union Starbucks. And I think workers across the country reached out because they believed in the ideals of the union, and they would quickly face some of the most intense union busting that any company has thrown at a union campaign. So I'm happy to talk more about that over the course of this, and more about how the Inside Organizer School is trying to overcome that. I think with Starbucks we saw, even when the union was reluctant to call for a boycott, that when there was grassroots boycotting around Palestine, around their union busting, that was what really had the power to make them shift course. So more on that to come.
I'm Lynn Hansen. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm in middle management at the CVS on Front Street, leading a union drive at that store. I am also involved in community organizing at the Billy DeFrank LGBTQ Center in the South Bay, part of the leadership team in their organizing committee. We are in early stages of the union drive, but it's centered around recurring issues with discrimination, harassment, and worker safety that upper management just seems to always turn like a blind eye to. We have a few people already involved, but like I said, it's early stages, and we're just trying to grow that base and kind of do it without upper management finding out. So.
Okay, great. I'm Veronica Hamilton. I'm a graduate student worker at UC Santa Cruz. I was the unit chair in 2019 and 2020 when we had our Wildcat strike. Now I'm just a regular rank and file UAW member, delegate to the Monterey Bay Central Labor Council. I'm also the graduate student researcher for the Center for Labor and Community, which is headed by Steve McKay, who you heard from earlier today. And we're doing a large-scale young workers project where we've collected over 2,500 survey responses from young workers across Santa Cruz County. And we're getting ready to do interviews with many of these workers to learn more about what might motivate them to organize their own workplace. And I think our broader goals at the center include trying to find ways to support new unionization campaigns among young workers, since it's, sort of electric here in Santa Cruz. So I'm happy to talk about some of the research that we're doing. My own dissertation work is about Starbucks. I worked at the Scotts Valley store here for about 5 years, so my own research is interested in how working conditions at fast food and retail stores reflect psychological dimensions of objectification or dehumanization. So how through policy, both social policy and then sort of interpersonal policy at work maintain like dehumanization of poor people of color through their workplace. So I'm happy to talk about any of those things. We certainly are facing a lot of retaliation at UCSC right now. We went on strike at the end of spring quarter, and thank you. This is a strike ultimately in support of Palestine, legally to challenge the university's response to student protests across the UCs. And they filed a temporary restraining order after CURB legitimized our strike twice. They filed a temporary restraining order which threatened to incarcerate some workers if we continued to strike, and would certainly include firing us. Despite the fact that many people stood down, 4 people are going through the firing process, and hundreds more, including myself, have received letters of warning, which is the first step to getting fired. So we are expecting increased retaliation at UCSC as a result. So we're very familiar with, I've been fired there before from the Wildcat strike, but I know that we're strong enough to get strike.
I'm Megan. I'm a worker at the REI in Santa Cruz and also a brand new union member. We won our election in April. We have just started contract negotiations. We've had 2 sessions so far, and we expect that it's going to be a bit of a long fight, especially because the main reasons for organizing at our store are around wages and guaranteed hours and predictable hours. We have been told consistently that REI can't afford to pay us to match the cost of living in our area, but you all know it's not really feasible to commute from a lot of more affordable places to somewhere like REI. It just doesn't make sense when you're making $19 an hour. So we're working to change that. It's going to be an uphill battle, but we're excited.
Hey everyone, my name is Chris. I was a SALT in Bessemer at an Amazon fulfillment center during the second election, and involved in the first election, and I've been kind of all in with the labor movement since then. My focus is in making documentaries and other video journalism. There's actually a film that's near completion about the origins of the Starbucks campaign. Jazz is the star of the show. So
Many.
one of many stars. Yeah, and actually the last time I was in Santa Cruz was during the bookshop Santa Cruz Union Drive. And Veronica, I think I actually interviewed you.
Yeah.
I just realized with the mask I didn't recognize, but in Celeste's backyard, right, 2020. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think my spiel, which I can talk about more if there's a chance, is that union busting is getting with the times and is becoming more elaborate and more online, and is making use of surveillance and of media. And I think Bessemer was very. I think Bessemer shined a light on this in a way that opened a lot of people's eyes if you were paying attention to that campaign. You know, they had drones tracking organizers. They were calling people with scrambled messages and potentially using GPS tracking on the app to see where workers were gathering and you know, changing the stoplight pattern. I could go on. It was totally absurd. But I think it's a very powerful tool, using media and using recording, that union busters are using, and that the labor movement should sort of, you know, match. And I think that as a worker, you have a lot of rights to record, right? There was this case recently in Pennsylvania with Starbucks workers, I think in 2023, that kind of set a precedent that you are allowed to record any protected concerted activity, even if it's illegal under state law, and which is big. And so I think, you know, it's important to document these things, and I think that during campaigns there's a lot of benefit to record these things and figure out how to use them strategically. So yeah, that's me.
Cool. I feel like I'm a loud enough talker. So I guess first things first, who here knows what assault is? Who doesn't know what assault is? Awesome. Okay, let's talk about salting. Does someone want to give a overview of what salting is?
Yeah. Salting is going into a workplace with the intention of helping your coworkers start a union. And it's not a malicious thing to do, which you know, employers are very keen on using this language of outside agitation. But the truth is, it's kind of intimidating process, I would assume, to start a union. And having help and support is important. And I also think that you know, salts are in a less precarious position going into a job, and have support. And yeah, let me pass the mic to Jess.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in.
Yeah, no.
I was just going to add, I mean, companies and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce have tried to ban salting many times, and they've, you know, had legislation that's mass-produced and sent in by the corporate lobbyists to try to ban this. And it all kind of boils down to, how do you even ban this? Because, you know, are you banning people who are paid by unions? Most salts are not paid by unions. I was the only person who went into a Starbucks who was working for the union in any way. Everybody else was a volunteer. Are you banning people with a certain political ideology? Well, I think most people, you know, who would theoretically support unions. And there's tons and tons of workers who would like to organize a union anywhere that they're working, but they don't know where to start necessarily. So I think one important thing about salting is that the lines are often very blurred, and that oftentimes people really want ways to get involved with the labor movement, but don't even know, you know, where that would begin. So a quick anecdote that illustrates this is Al Trelli was a worker in Buffalo who had unionized their job first at Perks Cafe, which was a little coffee shop, and then when the union busting got super intense, they ended up going to Spot Coffee, the unionized place where they became, in some ways, the chief steward, although they would say that everybody was a chief steward. And then in order to get out of the service industry, they took a job at Tesla. And when Tesla workers in Buffalo started organizing, which Chris and I were working on the campaign with them, all of their coworkers, when they learned what salting was, accused Al. Not in a friendly way, but they were like, Al, you have to have been a salt. You've done this a couple of times. And Al was like, no, I wasn't a salt. In fact, I had said, you know, don't even talk to me about unionizing because I don't want to be a salt. But I think the lines are very blurred, and people, if you have jobs, you should have a union. So in a lot of ways, everybody should be thinking of themselves as a SALT in their workplace. But the Inside Organizer School is designed to help, folks who want to learn how to organize do so, and then help unions who are trying to organize against these extreme odds of union busting, find people looking for pathways to organize, get connected with unions that actually want to take on those fights.
Local 5 is starting to solve things, so if you're an interested person who's like, I need a new job, hit me up, or I can connect you with someone who might be able to put you in the right job, or go to the Inside Organizer School, even better. So I guess my next question is specifically for Megan and Lynn, because y'all both are involved in workplaces where there weren't SALTs, but then you guys started to organize. So I'm curious for both of you, what was it that initially made you want to organize, and what was the process like finding the other people in your workplace who were also interested? Like, I know Lynn, you are the contactor, and just so everyone knows, Lynn works at CBS, which is a union company, but at a non-union CBS, so the protections around organizing there is a little bit different. CBS is a massive healthcare company. Their workers mostly can't afford healthcare. We're in contract negotiations with them right now. I encourage you all to stay up to date on that campaign. But yeah, for Megan and Lynn, what was it like to sort of be on that primary ship when there wasn't anyone on the inside who had some knowledge of the rules of organizing?
Yeah, so we didn't necessarily have a SALT, but I will say that there were two people who, when we first opened the Santa Cruz store back in 2021, they kind of immediately turned to each other and said, when are we organizing this place? So it's been in the process for a while, but it never really gained momentum until a couple months in, when everyone else at the store, the mask fell off a little bit. REI has been successful for a long time at putting forth a really progressive image, and the public thinks they're one of the best retail companies you could work for. And when you're being onboarded into a company like that, that's kind of all the information you have. And so everyone was really psyched about it at the beginning, and then a couple months in realized, oh, we're not getting any hours. Oh, we're not getting paid enough. And also some health and safety issues too that we organized around, specifically in our bike shop. And so from there, we had some momentum, and then the Berkeley and Soho ARIA locations filed for an election, and that's when our momentum really picked up, because we were really encouraged to see that they were able to do it, and so we could too. And the issues are company-wide very similar. The reasons why the other REIs have organized are very similar to why we organized.
I guess for me, I was working at my store for a little while already when I realized we probably needed a union. Just like ongoing issues of like me and other workers facing like harassment from both like customers and coworkers, and upper management not doing anything about it. I have several coworkers who are people of color who were denied opportunities at advancement, and I feel like there was a racial motivation to that potentially. I can't prove that, but it feels that way. And then also just like worker safety, both with like working conditions and just not addressing dangerous situations in the store in a timely way or like a good way at all. So I contacted UFCW, and after a little while they got back to me, and I got in touch with Althea, and we've been working on it since, and slowly building that drive.
Question for Veronica. I'm curious because you've done this survey of young workers, right? And you're also a data person yourself and a worker organizer. What is it that drives young people to organize? Do you have any insight or idea into, I guess not even what drives them, but what where it's happening and like how it's being capitalized upon in this like recent wave of organizing and like where it's strongest?
Yeah, so this young workers survey, we're still sort of like, the data is still coming in, the results are still coming in. But I can speak to this question despite not having those results yet. And from my experience organizing with the Democratic Socialists of America, the Labor Working Group, which is how you interviewed me, because I was part of that, and we were helping with the bookshop campaign at the time. It's really clear that service workers, both in food service and retail, in this area are actually very motivated to organize. We've had, I think over the last couple of years, we've probably had between 10 and 15 different people at different, stores come and talk with our labor working group asking how to start a union campaign. And this is all just from word of mouth. I don't think that we're really doing we have been doing very much to encourage people to come talk with us. But it just so happened that people, I'll say one of them because it's closed down now, like Cafe Gratitude. We were working on organizing those workers, and I think a lot of people were motivated during the pandemic because the working conditions had just become so dire, and there was also sort of like, the threat of becoming ill, and especially early on, not knowing what the consequences of getting COVID would be. And so food service workers, especially during that time, were confronted with, like, we are frontline workers, but we are not given the same amount of respect that many other frontline workers are given. And not only that, we're having to deal with increased harassment and poorer working conditions. So I think the pandemic definitely catalyzed a lot of organizing, but I would say that the conditions are, a really strong motivating factor. For graduate student workers, we had not been on strike. We had been in our union for 20 years, and we had not had a statewide strike. And in 2019, when we had the Wildcat strike, that was not expected. Somebody called for it in an email, and then 50 people said, I will too. It was spontaneous. And, we had thought about it, but we didn't think it would actually happen. And we were on strike for 5 months, and 75 people were fired. And, I think that kind of people who put a lot on the line, who risk a lot to do this organizing, are motivated by really problematic working conditions. Graduate student workers were living in their office, living in their car, and many who come from working class backgrounds can't even finish because it's just, you can't afford it. And so I think that motivates people, and then also their connections with their coworkers. And if it's not me that's living in my car, well, I know somebody who is, and they don't deserve that. So I think it's the combination of really problematic working conditions and then consciousness raising among friends and coworkers. That's what I see.
So I guess then we're arriving at this point of intersection in which so many people want to organize, but it's so hard to get organizing movements going and off the ground, and I think no one has better insight into why that is other than people who have been on the other side of the boss campaign. So I'm curious for all of you, both what were the material things that your bosses were doing to make your workplace more difficult and to try to dissuade you from unionizing? And also, what were the dynamics like amongst the group of people that you were organizing with over time, right? Half the battle of staying organized is outlasting the boss, and they have infinite funds to fund your, making your life worse, and you rely on them for your ability to keep living, right? For to pay your rent. So I'm curious what those looked like what the material things your bosses were doing were, and how, as groups you outlasted their attempts to spell for organizing?
I think even though I think you all are much better to answer this question directly, I will say there is one piece of our survey that I am familiar with the results, and that is that about half of respondents, when asked if they would be willing to join a union if they did not fear retaliation, about half said that they don't know. And so I think, to me, that speaks to actually there's a lot of space for just educating people about the process, because I think a lot of people just simply don't know. But who would love to?
I mean, I can give a quick overview from the Starbucks campaign, which was that they tested their playbook in waves. And I will admit here to a brief indulgence of labor history nerdiness. While driving through upstate New York, John, who's here, was like, oh, we're passing through the Mohawk Valley. Did you hear about the Mohawk Valley formula? And I had not heard about the Mohawk Valley formula. And it turns out that it was a playbook that a union busting company, the Remington Rand typewriter company, had come up with in 1936 to try to prevent workers organizing. And it involved closing stores, firing workers, opening new non-union plants, calling unions outside agitators, marshaling police forces, and creating violence. And so Starbucks did basically all of those except for explicitly organizing vigilante police forces. But they did all the other things. But they did them in waves. And so the first thing that they did when we started organizing in Buffalo was basically try to flood our stores with execs and managers to say, oh, this isn't the Starbucks experience. We want to give you the Starbucks experience. And of course, they were disrupting, surveilling everybody, spying on people, sending in hundreds of people to, have management presence on every shift so that we couldn't do any more organizing in the workplace. And then they had the president of Starbucks North America sweeping floors and cleaning toilets. And then that didn't work. They flew in the CEO, Howard Schultz, just before our election to give an anti-union speech where he compared Starbucks giving workers benefits to the Holocaust. That didn't work, to his amazement. So then, as more and more workers across the country started organizing, they resorted to increasingly draconian measures, including firing workers, including the entire organizing committee in Memphis, where they fired 7 workers in one sweep for talking to the media. When that still wasn't stopping organizing to the extent that they wanted, they started closing entire stores, like in Ithaca, New York, where all 3 stores had unionized, making it the first city with 100% union density in the country. And then when that didn't work, because students at Cornell were like, okay, if you're done with Ithaca, Ithaca's done with Starbucks, and got Cornell University to cut their contract with Starbucks and laid the seeds for future boycotts. Starbucks, did things, which they've been doing all along, but they did things like giving everyone at the non-union stores wage increases that they denied to the union stores. And so they gave them our bargaining demands, like credit card tipping, which they'd never had in 50 years. And suddenly workers at non-union stores were making about $5 an hour more than workers in union stores in credit card tips alone, not to mention the other benefits that they were now getting. So I think those were, the cornerstones. They did lots of other things, from overscheduling people to, whatever the opposite of what you wanted was, that was what you got. And there are hundreds of workers who were either fired or forced out, including me. And the labor board process was totally meaningless, which I think, we talk a lot about labor law and this is illegal or we need labor law reform, but the fact is the law is pretty much meaningless, and we're not going to get labor law reform without thousands and thousands of workers organizing and building a movement strong enough that we can actually demand this, which I think, having campaigns even against these odds that show what's going on. When Tesla fires 40 workers in Buffalo, there's a spotlight on that instead of it being swept under the rug. All of that is really important to actually show what workers are up against and create the public opinion necessary to create that change.
There's been no union busting so far as I know yet, because I don't think upper management knows about what we're doing at my CDS. But I guess I can talk a little bit more about the inaction from management that's kind of promoted or like caused us to like go for the union drive. So I mentioned that we had BIPOC colleagues who have been denied opportunities for advancement. In many cases, they've been in trainee management positions for years with no real reason or justification given. Another thing that deals with that intersection of identities is I have another BIPOC coworker in pharmacy who had to deal with a coworker who was using the N-word around her while on the shift, like on the clock. And management just dragged their feet on reacting to this at all. They eventually fired the person in question, but it took forever, and at the time it didn't seem like they were doing anything. For me personally, I transitioned on the job, and while most people have been accepting that I work with, I do have a coworker who misgenders me and has even preached at me while I've been on the clock, and they've taken no real action. I did basically, like when it became clear they weren't taking any action, I basically said, well, like if you're not going to do anything substantive, at least like don't schedule me with this person. And it seemed like they were agreeing to that initially, but then of course like they didn't really follow through on that either. And I've had other coworkers who were trans or non-binary and who had similar experiences. So it's just frustrating with that. And then to address the workplace safety, we've had conditions like we had an irate pharmacy customer who repeatedly, like after having a really bad experience in pharmacy and getting super frustrated, came to the front and we tried to help him, and he repeatedly said he was glad he didn't have a gun. And despite us having all of this info through the pharmacy, which meant like we had his patient profile, his name, address, and everything, no action was taken whatsoever to like ban him or like tell him he couldn't behave in this way, right? Another case, and I guess to expand on that, like of course all of us who were working that day and like experienced that, we're all worried like, well, is he gonna come back to the store and do something after he said this, right? And then upper management basically was just like, well, we'll just report it. No other action basically was taken, other than, well, we'll just send it up the line, right? And then the other thing, more recently, they cleaned the floors, but they didn't do it well. So they were left kind of like damp and smelly, and there were a lot of concerns because like it was slippery, and then also like a lot of us have headaches by the end of the day. So it was kind of like a health concern by that point. And again, no real clear resolution other than to just let it air dry.
Yeah, so REI definitely they did some similar things to the Starbucks campaign. One of the first things we experienced after we filed, we were able to keep it a secret until we filed for an election that we were unionizing, which was amazing and really speaks to the culture in our store. But immediately they brought in managers from other surrounding REIs, including ones from the Berkeley store who had already been through the union busting process and were kind of their top guys that were like really good at it. And now one of them is actually our store manager, which is great. But we were being watched all the time, and we weren't allowed to gather and talk to each other. They had workers who were strongly anti-union at the Berkeley store, and one other unionized REI write letters that they then posted in our break room that not only had a lot of misinformation in them, but also were very blatantly supposed to like tug at our heartstrings and, you know, think of the company, think of the managers, think of what you're doing to them. I had managers cry to me and ask me why I was doing this. There was a lot of emotional manipulation. But because we were the 10th REI to unionize, we've been able to prepare pretty well for what to expect. And they kind of seemed like they couldn't really figure out what angle to take to effectively union bust in our store, just because we kind of prepared for every scenario. We also had a really strong connected store culture. A lot of us are friends outside of work, and we all work really well together, and we're a pretty tight-knit group in a lot of ways. It didn't work. We won our election with Althea, do you remember, 79%? 78. It would have been higher though. There were some people on leave out of town, so it would have been higher. They were all yes votes. Yeah, but I think we got up a little bit light compared to the Starbucks campaign. Now we're really seeing it in our contract negotiations with how they're continuing to stall and taking advantage of how long things take at the NLRB. And the hearing for some, it's been what, like?
Yeah, so when REI Berkeley organized, they fired 8 young workers, most of whom were workers of color. Those were like the core of the organizing committee. They fired them. In addition, they took away summit pay, which is the annual bonus that workers at REI get, and all the merit raises that folks will get. And the hearing from the NLRB in Region 32, Oakland is one of the most progressive NLRB regions, just got pushed for the 6th time to October. This means that there's been years of workers waiting for money. They've been waiting for their money for years. And then the company goes and takes that and says to other workers who are trying to organize, right? Because there's a lot of different ways to build power, but one of them is to organize more stores, right? So you have a bigger hold over the market. They say to those workers, well, you're not going to get your summit pay. You're not going to get your merit pay. We already took it away there. Like, look at what's going on there. Don't you want to wait until they get a contract, right? So where Starbucks has been able to organize at this point, like what, 500 Starbucks locations? Like they've really, almost 500 Starbucks locations, REI has made, you know.
They also have a higher number of REIs though. Starbucks has 10,000 stores. REI has a higher percentage of REIs unionized.
That is true.
So,
and I guess this really brings us to the crux of the issue, right, is that workers are organizing. We can't stop them from organizing. Bullshit laws and the inability to enforce them, it doesn't matter, right? Because the power of solidarity is the thing that got all these workers up here today, you know, outside of their own bubble and connecting with their coworkers and with all of you. But then we enter contract campaigns where the ball is in the employer's court, right? We sit in their fancy offices, they drag it out forever and ever, because for them, the power balance, it doesn't make material sense for them to negotiate with the union, right? Because we haven't built the power necessary to make it unavoidable. We can make the moral arguments all they want, but what this is really about is how much power we can build for ourselves. And I think community is a really key part of that. And so I guess my last question is mostly for folks with Starbucks and UC experience around genocide in Palestine and how that was something that really motivated so many folks to take labor action, and also was something used strategically to get community support, right? Like the Starbucks boycott, that was maybe the most strategic thing they could have done, because all of a sudden the power of the union was exercising, you know, a really large boycott, and they were using their own, you know, labor violations as one of the reasons to motivate people around this other issue that they care about. So I'm curious how the intersection of labor rights and different issues play a role in the organizing you all do, and then how that intersection also helps you connect with other community groups.
Well, I could speak to a couple pieces of that. For our strike that we had, it had been growing a bit since October 7th, where many grad students had been trying to organize researchers against war, trying to find ways to disrupt any part of our labor that may be contributing to the military-industrial complex, and then more specifically to the aggression, the genocide in Gaza. And because people were eager to find ways to use their power in the situation where people were feeling very hopeless and deeply uncomfortable with the U.S.'s role in Gaza, those things motivated people to try and figure out, well, what part, my power is my labor, and how is my labor supporting this? So therefore, how can taking my labor away help in this sort of broader push for Palestinian liberation? So I think that's something that any worker can do. Think about like the company's investment in things like the military-industrial complex. And that's something that we were very interested in. And we were also joined in that fight on our campus with the encampment, the student encampment at UCSC, and then of course across the country. But then another piece of sort of like community and labor solidarity that's I think really critical, the piece I was just talking about is about solidarity as labor for broader goals. But my experience with the bookshop campaign, for example, so Bookshop Santa Cruz had unionized, I think it was 2020 or 2021, so really early in the pandemic. But one of the things that was really valuable about the connection between bookshop workers and the DSA labor working group is that we were able to show up as customers and as people who they couldn't fire or punish if we talked to other customers. And so I think that is sort of like a piece of power that most people have, is the assumption that they may be customers. And customers, like students in my position as a graduate student, are weaponized against workers, saying that, we can't pay you more, else we'll have to charge more for food or something like that. They're sort of like pitting against each other. But I think when we as customers can speak up in favor, I think it actually goes a long way. And then the other piece is, as union workers, really exercising solidarity during some of these larger campaigns. So when we were organizing Cafe Gratitude, we were working to organize the people who delivered groceries to Cafe Gratitude to no longer deliver groceries. So finding ways to make connections with other workers. With the Wildcat strike and then the two subsequent strikes since then, we had incredible solidarity, like sort of relentless solidarity from the metro drivers, who, despite being harassed by UC daily to continue to try to cross our picket line, they never did. Even when they never did. Metro has got to be like one of the greatest unions in our county. They're incredible. Yeah.
Is that an ASME union?
Smart.
No,
Smart.
Go
Yeah.
Smart.
Yeah, so that organizing, the bus drivers were happy to not do it. They endured harassment, for many weeks at a time, and still maintain that solidarity. And that is one of the strongest things that we had for our strike, is that the campus really can't run unless you have Metro. And so, yeah, I think solidarity as workers for larger movements, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm talking too long, for Palestine, solidarity as customers to push a little bit further than workers may feel comfortable doing for themselves, and then, solidarity across unions to show that, one person's struggle is also my struggle.
So I think one really important thing about the Starbucks Workers United Palestine statement was that we didn't think it would be controversial in the way that it became, because most Starbucks workers, like I think most of the recently organizing workers across workplaces, support Palestine automatically. And so we had made statements from the union Twitter account saying, COP unions don't belong in our labor federations, saying we support trans rights, saying, all these things. And yes, like Ben Shapiro didn't like it. No shit. So when we posted solidarity with Palestine, that was the majority opinion of Starbucks workers. But what we didn't expect was the backlash first within the union, where the president of the union was calling my boss and being like, your staff are supporting terrorism. And then he was sending me like, are we supporting terrorism? Question mark texts. So that was really fun. And then I think, the whole whirlpool of Starbucks boycotting that started first when Rick Scott from Florida, the Republican senator, called for conservatives to boycott Starbucks until they disowned their union, and then they responded by suing and disowning their union and giving out a list of every unionized store in the country saying direct your hatred toward these stores. Workers were getting death threats. It got really, really bad. But in the face of that, after the International Union had pulled the tweet, the workers organized to create another statement, a stronger statement, sign on to the Jewish Voice for Peace statement. Starbucks had been suing us for copyright infringement over the logo, and so that new statement was released after 97% of workers voted to endorse it in a union-wide referendum, with a logo that incorporated the keffiyeh pattern into the logo, as doubling down on that logo. And that also led, of course, Starbucks' response led to this global grassroots boycott of Starbucks. And we had said for a very long time that we would only bring Starbucks down with a boycott. The union had not been particularly interested in doing that because they were more interested in kind of Fight for 15 style shareholder action type things, not in having a picket line outside of every store to tell people, don't go in. And I think the really unseen consequence of that solidarity was that Starbucks ultimately said, okay, we want to come to the bargaining table because of that pressure. And now they're doing everything possible, including bringing in their new Chipotle CEO guy to try to pretend that the reason for their falling sales is not the boycott over Palestine so that they can avoid doing anything meaningful. But I don't think that is going away anytime soon.
Thank you, everybody, so much. I'm going to open it up to questions from y'all, if you have any. But sincere thanks to all of you for sitting on this panel. And I think there's so much that all of us have to add to our collective pool of skills and solidarity and power. And in this room, there are so many people who probably don't know each other and should. We all have shared struggles. But I will now open it up. Are there any questions? Yes, Leo.
I had a question on, forgive me, I recognize you I'm a customer at CVS.
Yep.
And you kind of answered my question a little, Veronica, what can I do as a customer at CVS? Another example is I was talking to a guy at grocery outlet from newspaper staff life. I was like, going to work anymore, so I got fired, so I was traveling. What can I do as a customer? What's my role in helping?
I'll just quickly say, so there are union CVSs and there are non-union CVSs, and we're in a contract fight right now with union CVSs. So I will let Lynn answer about her store, which is a absolute shithole. It's not. Just the way these workers get treated is absurd, okay? And CVS is a place that a lot of people, it's the only place they can go to get health care, and the workers on the front line are paid poverty wages, and they're consistently understaffed and in danger all the time. So the number one thing you can do is be nice to service workers. But there's a CVS contract campaign going on right now. You can follow UFCW social medias. We've been having rallies around that's coordinated with all the CVSs throughout California. So check that out on our social media and our website. Show up to a rally to support the contract campaign. Eventually Lynn's store will get that contract when they win their election. But enough union bullshit. Now I will give it back to Lynn.
If I put my management hat on, I would say give us good shops. My union hat would say leave a bad shop and specifically mention the bad working conditions or the ways that workers are being treated. Because by and large, that's all that corporate really seems to listen to. They don't listen to us, they only listen to the customers. So.
What is a good shop and bad shop?
Reviews, I meant to say. So like if you say get like a review on a receipt at a CVS, maybe mention something that you saw. It seems like they're much more eager to address things that customers see than things that employees see.
Yes, question for you, Lynn, about CVS. The other person was saying that there are some CVS stores that are unionized and yours is not yet. Your position as a mid-manager, I mean, one of the typical union busting techniques is to try and split workers. How is it in your situation? Are CVS or mid-managers going to be in the same, likely to be in the same bargaining unit as the rank and file workers?
Yeah, so I think anything below, I believe it's operations supervisor, which is what I am. That and below would be part of the union contract, and then anything above that, anything basically with hiring and firing power, so like manager pretty much has to be in the title, would not be part of the union contract. One good thing on that front is I do have 2 other members of management who seem strongly in favor and have come to union meetings before. There's also someone who recently got promoted from rank and file to middle management as well, and she seems open to the idea, maybe not quite as on board as the other 2, but like open to it at least.
And just to clarify, because we already have a contract at CVS, we know which positions are management and non-management, so middle management is in the bargaining unit. And this is like a classic union busting thing, right? Is they'll try to divide groups of people, they'll try to say that certain people, they'll name certain positions, manager. Lynn's position has the title manager, but is not a manager, and it is the same position that at Union CVS is included in the bargaining unit. So that all gets confusing, and you know, labor law is meant to trip us up and make us not organized sometimes. So. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm your USD School Board Trustee and Union Member Violence with AFM Local 6. I'm just curious, do you ever use the local media, or are any of the local media outlets helpful? Or the campaigns? I didn't know about some of this, but it's very exciting. I wouldn't be surprised if I'm not. I'm just curious.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, so the question was how, if at all, local media has been involved in helping get the word out about the movements at the places that we've organized. We had one feature in, I think it was Lookout Santa Cruz, that was very neutral and just said, this is what workers are doing. Interesting. And then the national REI union campaign has had some decent press. Most notably, I would say, was the Huffington Post article that came out a couple months ago. October. There was a more recent one too. Oh, yeah, October. Sorry. Where they interviewed a middle manager who would not have been part of the bargaining unit at the REI in Chicago. that got fired for not reporting union activity that he'd overheard fast enough. He did report it within a week, and that was because he was just waiting till a scheduled meeting that he had with upper management. But REI fired him for that anyway, and so then they interviewed him, and that article got a lot of traction. And then social media has been really big in the REI campaign too. If you follow REI on Instagram, every single post that REI makes, you will see multiple, the top comments are always people saying, why are you union busting? Like stop union busting your employees, pay your employees fairly. So that's cool to see.
At KSQD, local Santa Cruz radio station, we have some programs that we've run on unions. And so look for our show, Moment of Truth, and I think we have a couple union shows as a podcast.
Thank you.
I have two questions. One is, I have students who come to me pretty often asking me how to organize monsters, especially Kohl's, Target, Unido, Ross. Students fairly often are stores. And where would they go if they want to organize? And a lot of times they have field managers who also manage. The other question is, especially for young people, or anybody else who wants to change an existing union convention, what do you recommend? Because there's some existing places that are unionized, but especially young people or anybody else who wants to change the culture, when they start connecting, they find that they're assigned to, just get new members or just kind of doing more staff work for people who are already in the hierarchy, and it's just like another job, but volunteer. And it's not going to really organize anything or change what the situation is. So just like increments of wages or benefits that are not going to change the culture. So hope it's not too much.
I feel like Lynn and Jazz have so much to say about this, but I think our Wildcat strike was one in which we challenged union leadership, and that meant organizing on our own without sort of like saying, I'm interested in organizing with the union, what should I do? But instead, through rank and file conversations, we were able to mount that strike. So that was not in support. The union was not in support. Yeah. Okay.
I guess one thing I would say that helps a lot is building relational power with your fellow workers, having one-on-ones. That's a model that we use in the community organizing that I do. Just get to know your coworkers and understand what is it that they're struggling with and what do you have in common. Try to emphasize that you have more in common than there's more that you have in common that divides you, that sort of thing. And then of course reaching out to local unions, especially if you can find out, like in our case, that there's an existing contract, that could be very helpful. Or if there's any kind of existing relationship, that would help a lot.
Those sound like retail stores, so I'm gonna give you my business card.
Oh my goodness.
In a second. I don't even have it. Sorry. Josh, you take it.
No, I was just going to say, I think for those examples, I think reaching out to Althea makes a lot of sense. We also at the Inside Organizer School try to be a matchmaker between folks who want to organize and unions that are willing to take on the fight. So whether that's people looking to SALT or looking to organize where they are, our goal is to connect people and give them the initial training and then also the ongoing connections. In terms of the institutional union change, I think there's a lot of parts to that, and I think organizing new workers into these unions can sometimes be incredibly difficult because like with the Starbucks campaign, there have been so many challenges between the way that Starbucks workers want to organize and run a union versus, what SEIU thinks. But I also think that within all of these union structures, like Starbucks workers have been able to pull Workers United further on Palestine, for example, than anybody would have been able to without that kind of base existing within the union. And I think, friends at the RWDSU, which is the counterpart to organizing REI, et cetera, in New York and the eastern part of the country, their president of the RW is, I think, the head of the Jewish Labor Committee. And there's been all kinds of grassroots organizing within the union to have conversations, to bring BDS resolutions to the board that he ultimately ended up, supporting bringing those resolutions to the board. So I think, it's not necessarily the same culture in every union, because I think like RW has a much more welcoming culture in terms of having those conversations than SEIU would, for example, but at that top level. But I think that having a base of members who know how to organize their workplace will result in organizing within the union too.
Awesome. Yeah, we're going to wrap it up so that we all have time to introduce ourselves to each other. But I think that is a great message to end on. The answer to reforming our workplaces, to reforming our unions, to reforming government is organizing. It's not taking yourself too seriously, talking to your coworkers, getting each other in a room, and figuring out what you have in common, right? We have to act with strategy. Everyone knows that things are really bad, and there is a lot trying to stop us. But everything starts with talking to each other, and the more people you can talk to, the better. So thank you all so much. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. If you did not, please sign in so I can email you when REI Santa Cruz goes on strike or something of the like. And stay informed. Come to the Inside Organizer School. Send people in your union to the Inside Organizer School. Talk to young people you know. Tell them they might even get some extra cash if they salt and they really care about it. I mean, it takes all of us. And there's a place in the labor movement for everyone, despite what you might think. So thank you all so much.